To be here, back here at the ICT. This is indeed my fourth time, I believe, that I have had this privilege, and it is always, I should say, endearing to see so many professionals and practitioners gathered together more and more every year, and that's very much the spirit in which the United Nations is also working, which is that of convening and bringing together people from all parts of the world, particularly in this, one of the most challenging areas of international cooperation. And that's really what this is all about, is how can we build partnerships and cooperation going forward. At the outset, let me say how much we appreciate the efforts that Professor Boaz Ganor is making. We're always happy and privileged to invite him to the United Nations every year. And this is a reflection of the significance that we associate to the work that is being done here, the pioneering and path-breaking work in the field of counterterrorism that is taking place here in Herzliya at the ICT. Let me also at the outset convey to you the very warm greetings of His Excellency the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and of Under-Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov, who heads the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. Let me say at the outset that the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has made counterterrorism one of the highest priorities of the United Nations. Indeed, it was his very first reform last year after his election to create our new United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. And I'll have more to say that. This morning, you heard our distinguished colleague, Madame Michelle Konings, the Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, with whom we are working very closely. And one of the major efforts that we're undertaking is to really work in unison as one United Nations to deliver the support that governments and member states around the world are increasingly asking us to support them in regard to their capacity building and technical assistance in this field. Last year, each year, the ICT brings together leading policymakers and security professionals from around the world to discuss complex and evolving threats of terrorism. There is a great deal of original analysis and thinking that takes place here. I think that the theme of this year's conference, which is centered around the, quote, art of counterterrorism, and the 5 pillars covering the challenges that many of you face, such as understanding the terrorist threat and finding the right balance between protecting citizens and defending fundamental freedom rights, is very, very apt. We all need to think out of the box if we are to stay at least one step ahead of the terrorists, and that is to state the obvious. Indeed, we must recognize that quite often we are looking at the last terrorist threat when, in fact, the terrorists are already planning for the next one, the next big surprise. And indeed, despite the military defeat of ISIL in Iraq, in Syria last year, there is no room for complacency. Terrorist groups continue to pose a significant and evolving threat around the world. The United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy and its successive review resolutions, together with a large number of Security Council resolutions, provide a comprehensive international framework to address the scourge of terrorism in its many dimensions. The recent consensus adoption of the United Nations General Assembly in June, following the 6th review of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, sets a clear direction for all our counterterrorism efforts over the next 2 years. And why is that? Well, because the transnational nature of terrorist groups such as ISIL and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram means we need multilateral cooperation more than ever before in order to address the many different transnational threats. That is why, as I said earlier, the United Nations Secretary General convened the very first high-level conference on heads of counterterrorism agencies of member states in New York at the end of June. This was the first time that the operational agencies, not just the diplomats, not just the policymakers, but the actual frontline agencies, many of whom are represented here, convened together at the United Nations to really look at how we can forge more practical multilateral cooperation. Many of you attended and made valuable contributions. I know I'm speaking after lunch, but I hope to keep your attention by setting out our perspective, my perspective, on what Professor Ganor calls the art of counterterrorism, based on five key conclusions from the recent UN high-level conference that I just mentioned. First, we need to strengthen international counterterrorism cooperation and build new partnerships at global, regional, and national levels. There are many coalitions and networks that share actionable information to detect, identify, disrupt, and prosecute terrorists. But there is more that can be done to expand these networks and ensure that information and intelligence is shared in a much more timely, secure, and actionable way, especially in the regions most challenged by terrorism. For example, we need much better at sharing information on the identities of returning and relocating foreign terrorist fighters, FTFs. Security Council Resolution 2396, which was adopted last December, called on member states to notify other countries of the travel, arrival, deportation, or detention of individuals they believe to be terrorists. We must also prioritize the implementation of Resolution 2396 and ensure that countries most affected by terrorists have the capacities and resources to do so. The United Nations Secretary General has called for the establishment of a new network of counterterrorism coordinators to share intelligence and information, expertise, and best practices. And we are now currently consulting member states on how best to go about developing this call. Second, we need to adopt comprehensive and inclusive all of society, all of government approaches to countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism. There needs to be strong coordination between a broad array of partners, including law enforcement, security, intelligence agencies, civil society, the private sector, religious groups, health and education providers, academia, and the criminal justice system. They all have a vital role to play to strengthen the resilience and cohesion of our societies. This means starting at the grassroots level, where families and local communities are at the forefront of our efforts to protect vulnerable and young people. We should engage all those who can help us to achieve our goals. This must include young people. We need their dynamism and desire for change if we are to effectively counter the manipulative and insidious messages of violent extremists and terrorists. It also must include women, who are often the very first to spot the early signs of radicalization in young people. We must tap into their expertise and ensure a gender-inclusive approach to everything that we do. We also need to increase our support to civil society organizations who make a unique contribution in their respective communities. The United Nations Secretary General has announced that we are considering the establishment of a new mechanism in the United Nations to ensure that the views of civil society are fully reflected in counterterrorism policies and programs around the world. Third, there needs to be a renewed and sustained focus on preventing violent extremism and terrorism. Principled military and law enforcement measures are indispensable if we are to be effective in protecting the lives of citizens. But terrorism will never be defeated by military means alone. We need to pivot from the counter to the prevent. This means focusing our efforts on the underlying conditions that cause young men and women to be lured to terrorism, which often lie in poverty, exclusion, inequality, discrimination, and the denial of fundamental rights. The United Nations is working with a number of member states and regional organizations to develop and implement national and regional plans to prevent violent extremism. Fourth, we must ensure that counterterrorism measures fully respect human rights and the rule of law. As the Secretary General said in his landmark speech in London last November, quote, "Terrorism is fundamentally the denial and destruction of human rights, and the fight against terrorism will never succeed by perpetuating the same denial and destruction of human rights." End of quote. Lastly, we need to highlight the tragic human cost of terrorism. We must never forget that tens of thousands of people that have been injured, traumatized, or lost their lives during terrorist attacks. The survivors of these senseless acts of violence, along with their families and friends, need much more support and assistance from the international community. They need to be treated with dignity, and their voices need to be heard. The first annual International Day of Remembrance of and tribute to the victims of terrorism was held at United Nations headquarters last month, and that was a fitting way to remember those many communities around the world that are still suffering from the numerous acts of terrorism that have taken place. And this, the human face of terrorism and counterterrorism, is something that we need to focus much more on. Distinguished friends, colleagues, countering terrorism is one of the top priorities of the United Nations Secretary General, as I mentioned earlier, and as Madame Konings also mentioned this morning. The Secretary General has agreed that a United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact with 38 United Nations entities plus Interpol and the World Customs Organization has been forged to enhance and improve our own coordination. We, as the United Nations, which is under reform currently, need to be much more robust and impactful if we are to support member states and all of your efforts around the world in this business. The United Nations is delivering practical capacity building support to member states on key issues such as border management, aviation security, prisoner de-radicalization, and the needs of child returnees. However, there remains a deficit in international cooperation at the global, regional, and national levels. We need to focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. There needs to be a much more content to go with the rhetoric. Goodwill needs to be translated into practical and meaningful impact on the ground. The United Nations remains fully committed to working with all of you to strengthen multilateral counterterrorism cooperation and to build a more secure and prosperous future for all of us. Thank you very much indeed.